Build me an army worthy of Mordor. That was Sauron's instructions to Saruman in Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring when they were having a chat on the Palantir phone, of course. Now, what Saruman did was chop down some trees, and it seemed for every tree that he chopped down, he got this nice little bubble-wrapped orc turned up down in the bowels of Isengard. As you may know, we're running our Bane Wars campaign, which I need an army for. Fortunately, I have a much more ecologically friendly way of building one. So, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're going to look at creating the Legion of the Dead. Hi, I'm Robert Poyton, and thanks for joining me today on Dragon's Teeth. Yes, the Bane Wars campaign is underway now. We've got 5 armies, plus some wild cards floating around. And as you may remember, the setup for the campaign is this magic blasted apocalyptic wasteland in the centre of all the other territories, and each of the various tribes are now sending armies into this area in order to look for resources, magic items, and so on. So that's the setting. The next question then is, how do we build an army? Well, for this, of course, we're using the Fantastic Battles rule set, and in a minute I'll be going through how you can build your army using this method, which we find very good, very adaptable. That's the why and how we're going to build the army, but there's another question to answer as well, I think. If you're building an army, what is it for? What is the purpose? This could be for a competition game, it could be for a campaign setting, it could be for a quick game down the club on your next visit there or wherever you're playing with friends. So there's a few different reasons why you might want to build an army. One thing with the campaign, of course, is we have a specific setting, and I mean in general anyway, I prefer to build an army that has the right feel about it, even if it's for a competition game. To be honest, I've never been into competitive wargaming. I've never gone in for competitions. I mean, every game's a competition, right? Because we all want to win. But there's a difference between, I think, games you play at the club with your friends and then being competitive with it, going in for a formal competition. And I think if you were going to build a competition army using whatever rule set you're working with, then you want to build something that gives you the biggest bang for buck, right? So it might be, I'm going to have some dwarven gunners, and we're going to have some goblin wolf riders because they're really quick and they've got bows. We'll have some ogres because we want some big things. So you might get a strong army in game terms, but to me, that's not an army that sits together naturally. And I guess this is why, if we look at the rules often used for competition games, such as War Master and so on, you have very strict guidelines about what you can and can't put in your army. However, for a campaign setting, we've got this narrative going. So in our case, at the moment, we've got 5 different armies, 5 tribes, and each one has its own character. And I'm pleased to say that everyone has joined in with the spirit of that, and rather than think, oh, what's the strongest army I can put out in order to win a competition, people are thinking, what would a orc warband that is coming down from the hills and going into this area look like? That's what I'm going to go with. As well as that, of course, we have characters within the army, the commanders, the mages, the heroes, and so on, which play a big part in the campaign. But I'll describe all those next time. I'll go into detail on all of that next time. In this case then, each player has constructed their own tribe from the ground up. We've got orcs, we've got humans, we've got a couple of types of elf army, which are interesting because they're potentially in opposition. And for me, I'm sticking with my vampire undead theme. So the ruler of my tribe is the Lich Queen, the Mother of Bones, as she is known. And then under her, we have the various commanders. who are the aristocratic vampires, and then we go down into the various wizards, necromancers in this case, down to heroes, captains, down to your individual units. As I mentioned earlier, the function of this army is to go out into the Bane and explore. So really, it's like an expeditionary force. So we're going to have scouting built in. We don't need to put that into our army. And as I said, we're going to have our commanders and wizards and everything else on top. So we don't have to worry about that at the moment. But what we do need is a 1,000-point army. And for me, there are two ways we can go about this. I can either look at all the figures I've got, or I can make my army and then I can buy the figures. I've mainly done the first one because, as you may know if you're a regular on the channel, I actually started in 10mm with Warmaster. So I got into Warmaster, I bought a reasonably large sort of undead vampire army, and then we pretty much switched to Fantastic Battles. And one thing that I found using that method, because I said Warmaster restricts what you are able to use in your army, is I've got a pretty good 1,000-point army with the Warmaster figures I bought, but you're not allowed archers for some reason. So now we've got into Fantastic Battles, I'm able to have archers. So I've actually bought some extra skeleton archers in order to beef up my missile capability. So the army I have is mostly what I'd already bought, with a few extra figures thrown in. Of course, the other way to do it, as I said, is you make your army and then you go online and you can order those specific troops, specific units. What I'm going to do today then is, using the Fantastic Battles rules, put together a 1,000-point undead army based on the figures I've got here. There is, by the way, if you go onto the Facebook group, and I think maybe one of the web pages as well for Fantastic Battles, there is a spreadsheet that does a lot of the calculation, well, all the calculation for you. So you can use that, you can input what type of unit you want, what traits you use, and it automatically works out the points. So I'll put the link up for that down below. I'm a bit old school, so I'm just going to be using pen and paper today. Plus it's easier for me to film my figures rather than the computer screen. All right, so first things first, let's look at what sort of units we can have. Initially, we have three types of character or unit on the table. The first is what's called a company. So these will be a 40 by 40mm base of, for example, there's a company of ghouls. Now, a company can join with other companies, up to 4 in fact, and what we've started doing, just to avoid confusion, because we have found some confusion between companies and units and brigades and everything else, that is going to be a company for us. If there's 2 or more of those together, we're going to call that a regiment. Now, both can still be a unit, but where we've found some confusion sometimes is you might roll a dice for a whole unit, for example, to see if they retreat or stand or whatever. So that might just be the individual company, or it might be 4 of those linked together. That's still a unit. In our case, we're going to call that a regiment. However, when that group of companies goes into action, when they're joined together as a regiment, they might be rolling a certain amount of dice per company within the regiment. So it probably sounds quite straightforward, but you know, we're easily confused, especially when you get to a certain age, right? So that's the basic army unit, if you like, of the game, is the company. The second type, and these can be based pretty much how you like, will be the individual character. In this case, we have a sort of vampire hero there, or he could be a general or a captain. So they'll operate individually, though they can attach themselves to a unit. One other thing we've done with that is to make sometimes a little grouping of individual figures. So here, for example, we've got a magic user. We've got the mage at the front, probably the necromancer in this case, and his 2 acolytes behind him. And you might do the same. You know, a general doesn't stand on the battlefield on their own, right? They have a retinue. They're going to have a bodyguard. They're going to have a couple of aides, that kind of thing. So I think it's quite nice to have these little sort of command bases as well. But to all intents and purposes, they're still acting as an individual character. I also like to have things, these are really just for decoration, so I had a very nice standard bearer, but this is now something you have to be careful of when you buy figures, even in 10mm, because look, you had a really nice standard there, which effectively doubles the height of the character. So of course when I put him in the box to transport with all the others, even though I was quite careful, something has knocked it and the standard has actually broken off. So I'm going to have to try and repair that in some way. That's something I always consider now. I was looking at some samurai figures a little while back, and they had some really nice spearmen, 28mm, but the spears are about this long. I thought, I'm going to have real trouble transporting them, right? They're just going to bend and break off and all the rest of it, so I didn't get them in the end. Anyway, I do like to have a standard bearer or two around as well, purely for decorative purposes. And our final type of unit or individual will be the creature or the monster. In this case, a rather lovely tree Rex. So these represent monsters that an army might control. In the case of our campaign, these might be things that are lurking in ruined temples or in the jungle somewhere, or they might be things that the army has come across and somehow persuaded or coerced to join the cause. The next thing to look at are our company profiles. Each company in the army has a profile, and these are basically the company stats. So as you can see here, we've got Resolve, which is a sort of mixture of a unit's morale, its willingness to fight, the number of soldiers it has, and so on and so on. That is what is worn down during the battle, and of course when that gets to 0, the unit disperses. So this is nice because in this system that encompasses morale and casualties in one quite neat mechanic. The second number represents movement, so a movement of 3, for example, means 3 base widths. For shooting we get 2 numbers. The first one is the number of dice rolled at short range and the second at long range. Defense is the unit's resistance to attack, basically its strength. So that's what you need to roll on a dice on a d6 in order to inflict damage on the unit. And then we come on to traits. This is something that's unique to Fantastic Battles as far as I've seen. I'll get more into this in a moment, but basically you can sort of tailor make your units. You can give them these various traits that give them a bit more character. So we go beyond just having strength and movement and everything else. They get these unique characteristics as well. And finally, of course, we get the points value. Very important when we're keeping an eye on our overall value when we've got to reach 1,000. By the way, we're saying 1,000. You know, if someone's got 1,100 or someone's got 980, you know, it's not a big deal. 1,000, around 1,000 is fine for us. And of course, units in any army will differ in experience, in abilities, and so on. So the next thing we look at is deciding what type of company each one is. And they might be elite, which is what it sounds, your guards companies, your knights, that sort of thing. They could be a formed company, which are what you might call your regular, well-trained military type units. We get irregular companies, which are things like your war bands, your loose groupings of fighters. And we've already mentioned the idea of beasts, dragons, and so on. So each will have its own statistics. And again, this is nice because it doesn't matter what type of army you are taking. If you've got an elite company of skeletons or orcs or elves, whatever they are, then these are their base characteristics. Of course, they can be affected by our traits, but this makes building the army much easier because everything is working from the same a sort of standard, if you like, and we get to tweak them with our traits. So those are our type of company. I've mentioned traits a couple of times. Let's have a quick look at those next. We have a long list of traits, and these next pages in the rules go through each one in detail and explain what they are. So each unit can have, I think it's up to 3 traits. There is also scope to have a sort of overall trait for your army. So for example, dwarves are going to be doughty because that's what dwarves are. but then each individual company can have its own traits as well. So if we look at some of these, for example, Feast, which is quite appropriate for some of my vampire units. The Feast trait can be used to represent any unit which is invigorated after destroying and eating its enemies, such as werewolves, vampires, ghouls, etc. There's a point cost, of course. In that case, it's an extra 4 points to have that trait for a particular company. And what this trait does is, if a foe engaged in melee scatters, a unit with the Feast trait immediately restores 1 lost resolve per company in the scattering unit. So if my unit of ghouls, for example, scatter a regiment of 3 companies, then they get 3 resolve points back from the resultant feast. Very nice. And it's not the case that these traits are necessarily beneficial, because we've got examples like slow. So you can give a unit the slow trait, which takes 1 off of its movement, and that then you take points off. So if you really want to build up your army with numbers rather than quality, then this gives you a way to do that. Another example down here, unreliable. That's -4 points per company, which is a fair amount of points. So, you know, if you want to bulk out your army with some unreliable units, then you can do that as well. Some are really expensive. Terrifying, for example. I guess that's going to be your monsters, or again, some of your undead types. But that's 25 points, and that significantly impacts the enemy's willingness to engage with you. So a very useful one, but that comes at quite a high point cost. That's the structure for building our army then. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each unit in turn, each company, by looking at the figures I've got here, and I'll tell you how each unit is formed, what its particular traits are, and so on. Alright, now where there's vampires, we've got to have bats, right? So the first unit up are the bats. I've got a couple of companies of these. Now, these aren't your big sort of giant vampire bats, these are just normal, and because of that I've given them the trait of swarm. They've of course got the flying trait because they're flying creatures, but what swarm means is this is a huge cloud of bats. That does give them a minus on their resolve and such like, and they're already an irregular company, so their resolve isn't that great, but they're pretty quick and they're very difficult to shoot down as well. Anyone firing at them with missile fire gets some minuses. So fast moving around the battlefield, which for an expeditionary force is good for scouting ahead, for maybe trying to take or explore certain terrain features, and so on. And sticking with the Children of the Night theme, what beautiful music they make. Next up we've got some wolves. These are a formed company, and again I thought for a expeditionary force these are fast moving. They also pack a bit of a punch, these. Not only are they fast, I've given them the trait of Furious Charge, which gives them a +2 modifier when they first charge in. And that feast trait, it seemed appropriate to give them that as well. So they get to feed on their enemies and restore any lost resolve points. From there we start working into our undead units, and this is one of the heavier foot units. This is a Skeleton Guard Elite company, so heavily armed, heavily armoured. Now, one thing you get with undead is the trait of Mindless, which has sort of pros and cons really. On the one hand, they do suffer a minus to their melee value. However, they don't suffer resolve loss when friendly units scatter. In other words, they don't really have morale as such, because, you know, they're mindless. The same also applies for impetuous actions. They're less inclined, or even not inclined at all, to be impetuous. However, if the mage or necromancer who controls them is killed or scatters, then, you know, that pretty much breaks them. They suffer an immediate -5 of resolve. So they've got the mindless trait, and the other trait I gave these as well was heavy melee weapons. So they're very effective at melee. However, they are quite slow. They've only got a movement of 2, and I found in some of our test battles they do take a while to get up to the front line. Now, speaking of heavy units, the next thing we're going to look at are the cavalry. Again, this is an elite company, so quite a heavy unit, Dark Knights. Basically, these are Vampire Knight cavalry. So a good resolve, they're an elite unit. And the traits they've been given are mounted, obviously, because they're cavalry. It seemed appropriate to give them the Furious Charge again to get that bonus. And of course, being vampires, then they've got that Feast trait as well. I've found these pretty effective in test games, quite fast moving, and they really do pack a punch when they hit home. So from one end of the scale to the other, from the heavy elite cavalry, we come down to the zombies. Not got many of these at the moment. Of course, they're mindless, as you'd expect for zombies. I also thought it'd be fun to give them the trait of being malodorous. So they emit a foul stench, and that affects any units within 1 base width. Now, that can be friend or foe. Those units suffer -1 on their melee, and mounted units suffer -2. I guess horses don't like the smell of zombies. This is an advantage with the mindless trait as well, because any mindless unit close by to them, they're not affected. I guess skeletons and zombies, they can't really smell, can they? Or they don't really care. Anyway, that's the zombies. As I said, I haven't started out with many of those, because my way of thinking is with the vampire army who have a necromancer, after a battle is over, he's going to have plenty of fresh recruits as zombies, right? So these are something that can be added in as we go along to replenish any losses. A short step up from the zombies, and probably the units that make up the bulk of the army are our regular old skeletons. So Skeleton Foot formed company. Again, these are mindless, of course. The other trait I thought I'd give these was fast. So they move 3 as opposed to the skeleton guards who move 2. So a little bit more speedy. Now, again, they're not that great in melee, but their defense is reasonable and they are pretty fast moving. So really that's the bulk of the foot forces, and with the points value I can get in quite a few units of those. I mentioned skeleton archers at the start, so I've got a couple of units of these. Again, formed company, but these are the only missile troops I've got at the moment. I do have some more that I'm going to be painting up. Again, you've got to have some missile capability, I think. These are sort of average at shooting. The only trait they've got so far is shooting, funnily enough. Of course, they're mindless as well. I may look at giving these another trait as well, perhaps fast, in order to speed them up. Again, I want to get these in pretty quick, start taking out the enemy from a distance, and then allow the heavier units to come in and clean up, and feast, of course, as well. I've also got some skeleton cavalry there as well, just 1 unit of those. Again, at the moment they're being used as scouts or to race ahead to particular points of interest on the table. Again, mindless, mounted, that's pretty much it for them. That just leaves us with the ghouls then. Pretty slow moving, but strong, once again. And their traits are skirmishers, so they're like a sort of open formation company. That means they can pass through friendly companies and so on. And these also have the trait of berserk as well, which means in melee, if they roll a 6, they get to re-roll an extra dice for damage. Again, I might tweak these a little bit as we go along. I feel like in a way they should have the feast trait as well, but you know, there's only so many points to play with. And there in its entirety, the 1,000-point Legion of the Dead Army, ready to go forth and do battle under the banner of the Lich Queen, Mother of Bones. That's how it's starting, of course. That's going to be tweaked as we go through. They're going to suffer losses, they're going to get reinforcements, and, you know, they'll probably, as I said, recruit some zombies, and maybe 1 or 2 other nasty beasties that are lurking around. Do keep subscribed to the channel if you want to keep track of that. As I say, next time I'm going to look at the command structure We've also tweaked some of the magic a little bit, and I believe we're going to have our first movement orders coming out in the next week. So we shall start our regular reports and keep you up to date on what's happening in the Bane Wars. As always, thanks to everyone who has subscribed. If you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe. Keep your comments coming in, they're all much appreciated, and I'll see you next time.